been going on, it kind of feels like it's resulted in this large political awakening of the masses. I think people are eager and hungry to learn and explore new ideas. And with this, what you see is people beginning to look to the past. And I think this is important because it's important that we look to the past to understand the struggles that we have gone through and solidify our understanding of how mass, working class and the poor have fought for us. And so Malcolm X has become one of these figures that's kind of been thrust into the mainstream media. And you'll regularly hear people quoting him because he is actually quite a truly fascinating figure. But I think he's also quite misunderstood. He has a complicated history. And I think when you understand a little bit about this history, you start to understand the true gravity of his legacy. So I'm going to give a brief introduction into like a bit of his past because it's very fascinating, but it's very long. So if I just talked on his past, we'd be here for like 3 hours. And then we'll talk more about the legacy because I think that's really very important. So you could almost say for Malcolm that he was kind of born to be an activist. Malcolm was born in Ohio, Nebraska. He was the fourth of 7 children to Reverend Earl Little Sir and Louise Little, who became activists. And they were part of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. And his parents, being part of the UNIA, was a Black nationalist group who set up a program to organize capitalism in the interest of Black people. They set up Black-only businesses, banks, housing associations, and pulled the community together around a network of churches. And this was not uncommon in the South where Malcolm was born and growing up. We're talking about an extremely, very deepful and painful time in America, especially in the South, when the KKK, police brutality and segregation were strong and very much ruling. And Malcolm's parents were no stranger to this type of brutality. His family were forced to move many times. Malcolm actually remembers his house being firebombed when he was only 4 years old. And then it would be only a couple of years later after this incident when Malcolm would face his first real big tragedy, and that would be losing his father. And it was never officially called a hate crime, but by every account, it was very much clear that Malcolm's father was killed by a KK member, and his body was left in the street of a very public area for everybody to see. And of course, this was extremely distressing to his mother, who eventually had a breakdown and was no longer able to look after her children. So by the age of 12, Malcolm has now been put into foster care and spending many of his time away from his other siblings and in group homes. But he still was a very much thriving and bright and intelligent child. He recalls in his biography an incident when he was speaking to his teacher because he had decided that he wanted to be a lawyer. And he's very excited, and he goes to his teacher and says, "That's it, I've decided I'm gonna be a lawyer." And his teacher says something really interesting to him. And bear in mind, I am going to use a racial slur, but I'm using it for effect. So apologies for triggering anybody. But his teacher replies, "You've got to be realistic. That is not a realistic goal for a nigger." And it was only be a couple of months later that Malcolm would actually drop out of school altogether. He would eventually move to Boston to stay with his sister Ella, like many other young Black boys in the South, hoping to find a better life in the North. He fell into this new cool crowd of kids and used crime, drug dealing, pimping to support himself. And it would be this lifestyle that Malcolm falls into that would propel him into his next stage of life. So Malcolm X ended up, after this long stream of life of crime, being imprisoned for 10 years for a burglary. And it's this burglary that Malcolm gets his first real intense induction to the wider injustices of the system. So Malcolm, with 4 other accomplices, only one of them being Black, and 2 other white women, were all busted for this case. But there was clear that there was an intense set of racism at the heart of the US court rooms from the start of his trial. So Malcolm and his other Black accomplice Shorty were referred to as Schwarzes, which is German for Black bastards. And actually one lawyer told him and Shorty that they had no business associating with white women. So while Malcolm and Shorty both end up taking pretty intense long sentences, the 2 other white women faced no repercussions. And it's through this that Malcolm was eventually recruited in prison to the Nation of Islam. So the Nation of Islam was a black separatist organization led by Elijah Muhammad, or as they would call him, Prophet Elijah Muhammad. It was not connected to mainstream Islam, but it preached that white people were a product of a genetic experiment by an evil black scientist called Jacob, and that their time on earth was coming to an end. It was set up in the 1930s amid the Great Depression by their founder, Wallace D. Ford. And they believed that it was the task of black people to separate themselves from white society and prepare for a judgment day. Now, the Nation of Islam held a huge appeal for people who were persecuted and marginalized, like Malcolm X has felt. It built its support networks through black businesses and mosques, which bolstered racial pride and gave refuge and support to victims of a racist system. And so Malcolm's life experiences and his hardships greatly attracted him to the way of thinking, and he fully immersed himself in the group, quickly making his way up the ranks. So by the end of 1953, Elijah Muhammad had selected Malcolm to serve as basically one of his top ministers in Boston. Malcolm was extremely successful in recruiting people and was able to actually set up his own mosque temple number 11 in Boston. And that's because Malcolm was a fantastic speaker. He studied speaking while he was in prison, and he was able to rally around crowds. And so he has this fantastic run with the Nation of Islam, makes his way very high up in the ranks, does fantastic speeches all over across the country. But towards the end, Malcolm begins to see the limits of the Nation of Islam at the height of really his political career. As a national minister, he regularly intervened on the behalf of Nation of Islam, but was actually routinely pulled back into line by the leadership when speaking on political issues. And the split that he eventually takes with the Nation of Islam was writing on the wall, and the stage was officially set. But it takes place, this split he takes with the Nation of Islam, when he was banned for speaking for 90 days after the assassination of JFK. So the Nation of Islam, after the assassination of JFK, had told all its members, but in particular Malcolm, not to speak on it. Malcolm ignored that and actually said, when asked, does he feel sad about the death of JFK, he was told no, he doesn't cry when chickens come home to roost. And this really, really embarrassed the Nation of Islam. And so he was punished by a 90-day silence, but it was pretty clear from everybody inside and outside of the Nation of Islam, this was just the first step in them excluding him from the organization, which they eventually did. But there was also a series of closed-door politics going behind with his popularity, and mainly the leadership, who happened to be mainly of Elijah Muhammad's sons, fearing about his power and his influence. But it's the split that's quite important for Malcolm, because it was only then really that he was allowed to freely speak on the matters that he's really interested in, and form his own political ideas, what I think, which made Malcolm the Malcolm that we kind of follow today. He went on this global pilgrimage called Hajj and traveled the world and became an internationalist. He began to start rejecting the ideas of black separatism and went on to follow the readings of Marx and Lenin. And so it's this time he starts leaning also into ideas of Pan-Africanism and rallying the working class and making his famous speeches like by ballot or by bullet. And he also visits Britain twice. And so he goes on this height of exploration of more socialist ideas. But it's only 1 week later, after his visit to Britain on the 21st of February in 1965, that he was shot several times at a OAAU rally, which is the organization he ended up forming after he left the Nation of Islam in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, New York, leaving behind his wife, Betty, and 6 children. But I think it's very important that we understand him beyond his death, because like I said in the beginning, history is a very powerful tool to use, and as socialists we don't just admire people for people's sake, we have to understand their importance and their legacy. So it's almost 55 years after his death, so why is Malcolm still such an important figure? And I think he's still such an important figure because to this day, he's still one of the most unapologetically radical thinkers and leaders of an anti-Black movement that the world has ever seen. To quote another memorable group the Black Panthers, who was also inspired by his legacy, he brought a sense of power to the people. His words spoke of a grand collective power that for Black people. He spoke to the poor, the uneducated, the criminals, the masses, and to people who had faced over 400 years of oppression and some of the most brutal violence against them, telling them, empowering them with words such as, you can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. And he spoke to them with this sense of truth and honesty that wasn't always palatable. And he made no secret about the FBI monitoring and the daily threats on his life and family. In fact, actually, 1 week before his death, his house was actually firebombed again. And so whether you disagree or agree with some of his more spiciest statements, you can't ignore the sense of urgency and militancy that he spoke with about the state of racism in America that at that point was truly unheard of. And Malcolm was not an armchair revolutionary. His mental courage derived from his knowledge that within struggles of the masses of Blacks in America rested the solution of racial oppression. And seeing Malcolm fight for Black people in a way that at times, like I said, was very unpalatable for some, provided so many with the confidence to start change and dedicate their lives in also being anti-racist activists. And so when you have someone like that assassinated, it leaves a lot of questions unasked and a gaping hole in history, because we know that towards the end of his life, when he was coming up away from the ideas of Black separatism, when he was also willing to work with Martin Luther King and began moving closer to each other, and this international and connecting struggles together, that the story stops. And I think it's in this very moment that Malcolm had reached a new height of revolutionary consciousness, that his life and developments were ended. And I think that's why he resonates so much with the current Black Lives Matter movement. I think in times of deep trouble and on brinks of change, people connect and are drawn to those who offer real alternatives to the systems that we face. So don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely enthralled by the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's been fantastic. I think it's been energetic. But when I picture the revolution, I pictured it being a little bit more than Black Lives Matter tweets from Ben and Jerry's in Yorkshire tea. Because I think when you get down to it, a few hashtags and simple parliamentary politics just doesn't cut it, when what you see people asking for is ultimately the end of all oppression for all people. And many people will now collectively agree that the system isn't working, and that it's brilliant, and that's something to be celebrated. And we shouldn't undermine that so many people are on the same page when it comes to fighting racism and are willing to step up and fight the good fight. But if you lean slightly more on the edge of a revolutionary and a socialist like myself, and I believe Malcolm towards the end of his life, will begin to start to argue that the change we want to see can't be reformed into the system. Malcolm talks about this after his trips to Africa. He says, "It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of Black against white or purely an American problem. Rather, today we're seeing a global rebellion of oppressed against oppressor and the exploited against the exploiters." You see, capitalism and racism are intricately linked. And they're linked because what we've learned from history, that there isn't actually anything that naturally, biology, or historically actually makes us racist. There's nothing sort of like a racist gene. And actually, for the long period of human history, whilst other forms of oppression had existed, the racism in the way we see it today was relatively new. The racism that we're seeing today was born out of the transatlantic slave trade at a time when the world was taking huge steps towards industrialization and forming new economic structures, many of which are still in place today. And so it's that wealth that was created under the transatlantic slave trade by hurling Black bodies across the seas, beating and abusing people, that propelled the West into this superpower status. Because there's profit in exploiting people. You can really only exploit people for so long if you continue to feed them narratives that they're less than. And so you've got to do this divide and rule and divide and rule and divide and rule again. And I think you can't have a world without oppression when profit is still on the agenda. So I think you can't trust the same system to get rid of itself, of the crises that it continues to cause and continues to uphold. So we've seen over the past couple of weeks, people really saying that this is not a moment, this is a movement. But what do we really mean when we say that? Because I think when we say that, we have to take on the responsibility that we actually have to take steps into making that happen, because the system will do everything in its power to avoid change. And it's in these times that we need to follow Malcolm's lead and be bold in our statements and bold in our demands and our actions. And I think that's going to take a little bit more than white people just checking their privilege. But it's also important to note that this fight against racism shouldn't be a fight that only Black people endure. It is a fight that we all must collectively take, because a world that tears down this rotten system and a world that is anti-racist is actually a better world for all. But also because when we come together in a sense of solidarity and through organising, that's when we are the strongest. So if you take anything away from today, I think you should take away that change can spring up from anywhere, and often in the most unlikely places and at the most unlikely times. How a boy who dropped out of school at 14 from the Deep South turned out to be one of the world's greatest revolutionary leaders is quite a mystery. How one out of the thousands of Black deaths in police custody erupted into months of the most mobilized anti-racist movements that we're seeing, at least in my lifetime, is quite unknown. But what is known is that we need lasting change. It's simply not enough just to accept things are bad. We must come together and tear down the system by any means necessary. And I think if you're searching for a place to help make that change, I seriously urge you to consider, if you have not, joining the Socialist Worker Party. Because I think we are a party that is committed to being anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and bringing power back to the people, to the workers, to the youth, to the oppressed and the forgotten. And so I look forward in joining you all in the fight. Solidarity.
Thank you. Yep, thank you, Elizabeth. That was really excellent, and lots, I think, there for people to think about and make contributions. And as I said earlier, please do ask questions. Don't feel you have to make a long contribution, but please ask questions and work out in your head, you know, ideas. That's what we're here for as well. For those of you who've joined since, my name's Andrea and I'm chairing. So just note about how to contribute. If you click on your participants icon at the bottom of your screen, sort of in the middle, you'll see your name, and then you can see at the bottom that you can also, if you click on the three dots, you can raise your hand. That's how I'll know you'll want to speak. You'll have to unmute yourself as well, and if you can, keep your contributions to around 3 minutes, and that's more for the older members who, and you know who you are, then please do so, but I'm not going to cut anyone off if they're making a good contribution. So yeah, if anyone wants to speak, please please indicate with your hands up icon. How do I get back to see them? Has anyone got, okay, so just bear with me. It's the first time I've chaired. I've got Mark.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can Elizabeth hear me? Yeah, okay. Right. I'll start the contribution off. And what I'm interested in is like the National Association of Coloured People, or the Advancement of Coloured People. That was the 1950s, I think, and they were interested in setting up basically the advancement, like getting one in education, setting up businesses, like you say, and stuff like that. And then you have the separatists. The thing is, how strong is the pull for separatism? You know what I mean? And how strong is it now for separatism? Because there is that African separatism movement going on. And I think people are bringing attention to Zimbabwe, where they're sort of like reclaiming the land, which is slightly different, I think, you know what I mean? But they're using that as an excuse to sort of say, no, what, you know, it's a challenge to multiculturalism. But I think the separatism in Zimbabwe is slightly different over here. But there is a pull for separatism, isn't there? I think amongst the black community. I mean, and I don't blame the idea of it. Do you see what I mean? You can see the attraction of separatism and why it would seem so appealing to a lot of people to become separate and do it. You know, all whites are racist, basically. That was the argument, wasn't it? I'm interested because Muhammad Ali broke away virtually at the same time, didn't he? And he turned his back on that separatism movement as well. I don't know after or before Malcolm X, you know what I mean? Because obviously he had a lot of dealing with white businessmen and saw that contradiction, you know what I mean? And that's the thing with separatism, it throws up a contradiction all the time. And is that a myth, or was that true about the white lady who asked him about how she could help? And he turned her down quite aggressively and says, I have no need for your help. Was that a true story? I'm interested in that side. Anyway, I'll leave it there, all right.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Haven't got anyone else indicating at the minute, so if anyone's on the verge of making a contribution, please do so. Okay, I've got Andy from Leicester. Andy Leicester.
Thank you. I thought that was a really excellent contribution by Elizabeth. And I mean, I think, you know, Malcolm X has, I mean, clearly, as Elizabeth said, has become really important in terms of people looking for alternatives and, you know, what do we want to get out of the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. But, and I think, you know, that some of his ideas are really, really important. I mean, clearly, you know, there's an issue of where he was going in terms of his ideas and beliefs towards the end of his life. But I think, you know, I mean, the issues of nationalism, and I think, you know, a crucial debate to be had between nationalism and Marxism, and also the issue of Islam, which, you know, in one sense is a sort of nationalist or of sort of alternative independence movement. But clearly the issue of Islam is incredibly important across the world today. And I think with the failure of the overturn of the regimes in Russia and Eastern Europe, there's been a lack of confidence in terms of socialism. And for an awful lot of people, I think on a world scale, they are turning, and obviously especially Muslims, but turning to sort of Islam, radical Islam, Islamic influenced ideas. So clearly Malcolm X has become more important in recent times. So it's really important that we talk about his ideas. I think, I mean, just one thing, I mean, in terms of sort of independence and separatism, I mean, there's the whole issue of the independence of the African states and the great hope that people had in terms of African nationalism, and, you know, the total failure of that you've got some of the most brutal, some of the most unequal societies in the world now across Africa, and, you know, especially, you know, South Africa is now one of the most unequal countries in the world. So I think, you know, we have to look at an alternative vision rather than an alternative where we like form our own countries, or we work out, you know, how to make, you know, Trump says, how to make America great again, that we actually look in terms of class. And I think the real thing that divides people across the world is class, is the inequality that we have, rather than the different nations that we belong to, or the colour of their skin, or religious beliefs and so on.
Thanks, Andy. Dave Kersey.
Oh. Hi.
Hi, Mamuna.
I just wanted to ask a question, really. I just wanted to know, there seems to be quite an awful lot of assassinations of leaders just as they reach their zenith. And is it at all a wonder that Malcolm X was killed, not necessarily at the time when he still had black nationalism politics, but when he actually moved from a kind of a divisive line to a more class theory based line, and a class understanding of society and how society is divided. Is there any sort of coincidence that it was at that time that he became even more dangerous and therefore in need of being silenced permanently? Because, you know, you look at figures in history, Martin Luther King, number of people that have been killed. I don't want to put, what's his name? The president that was killed, what's his face? Kennedy. I don't want to put him in the same bracket as Malcolm X and King and people like that, but there was also with him, with Kennedy, this understanding that perhaps he was more pulled for reasons which were politically more agreeable towards ending Black oppression. Just how far he went with that struggle is hugely and highly debatable. But I just want to know, people seem to be killed by whoever. Allegedly, is with Malcolm X, it was a black man that killed him. But you know, people could be paid and bought off and to do things. The state really gets to a stage, it feels like, where they feel they have no option but to actually murder ideas almost. And I just want to, yeah, I'd just like to open that up a bit and get some views on that.
Thanks very much, Mamuna. Really great contribution. Got Dave Allen next, and then nobody else. So if anyone's on the verge of making a contribution, please do put your hand up.
Hi, sorry. Yes. Right. So I wasn't expecting to get called this quickly. Oh, okay. Yeah. Just to report back really on what happened at the weekend with the Black Lives Matter demonstration in Leamington. It was the second Black Lives demonstration that's been called in Leamington. Again, quite an unusual event, because Leamington is, as you'll know, a fairly white town, and it was a fairly white demonstration, but it was also very young. I mean, I would guess from observation, the average age of people was somewhere in the low 20s, maybe 21, 22. There was about 100 people there, quite a lively, noisy demonstration. Lots of attitude and quite overwhelmingly friendly. It was smaller than last time, and people were a bit worried about that. The fact that 3 months after the first after the death of George Floyd, is it 3 months? I think it is. 3 months after the death of George Floyd, we're not seeing the same level of anger and demonstrations in the country. But you know, talking to people afterwards, you know, you've got to remember that 6 years ago, when Black Lives Matter first erupted onto the scene, it was a very short-lived thing, and there weren't demonstrations in every little town like Rugby and Nuneaton and Leamington all over the country. So this is a qualitative change in what's happening in the attitudes of people. And going back to something that was said earlier, you know, one of the problems for dealing with this these days is that capitalism doesn't have the leeway. They can't offer people a better life at the moment. You know, so people are looking at the world and seeing that it's you know, it's quite frightening, and there's no real prospect of things getting better for the majority of us now. In fact, you know, it looks like getting a lot worse with the recession that's due to come as part of this COVID package and everything else. So, you know, there's also that about what's happening these days, and in a way, it explains what went on in France last year and what's been going on in Portland in the United States these days. Is that there is real anger with people. I mean, people in the United States must be absolutely desperate. You know, no social welfare whatsoever, despite the massive wealth of the country. And you see people like Bezos making $10 billion in a day. I mean, what is that about? So, yes, I think there's real prospects. This movement is more impressive than it was 6 years ago. And, you know, who knows whether it's going to fizzle out or turn into something much more hopeful, like, say, what's been happening in Portland. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I've got Patricia.
Hi everybody. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Patricia.
That was fantastic. Really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I was thinking about what you said about Malcolm X when I get a feel from where he was from his post-Kennedy death comment, you know, no, I don't cry when chickens come home to roost. It's like he's saying, I'm not wearing the shit anymore. And it's interesting that at the time he's embodying revolutionary politics as he did, and Martin Luther King. I was writing this when Ramona was talking. I thought, oh, she's answered the same question as I am, but I still feel this, that he becomes more threatening. So you see the toleration of the separate black businesses, etc. That is tolerated, is it still doesn't threaten capitalism, but the threats to capitalism are what makes business sit up and multinational corporations. So that's where the power lies, isn't it, in the movement when it threatens capitalism. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I haven't got. Oh yes, I have. Am I in? Yeah. So I've got Mike Vroom Vroom. I think. Next. You there, Mike? Unmute yourself.
You hear me?
Yeah, I can now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Malcolm X. Yeah, interesting guy. Yeah, I think he's part of the kind of. I think you know what I know about him. He started out really kind of. I mean, you know, he experienced the kind of racism and police brutality, you know, when he was growing up and stuff. And I guess, and he kind of joined the Nation of Islam, didn't he? And he believed in kind of like black nationalism, the idea of the black nation itself, and whites had no place in it. And I can understand that because, you know, the most immediate source of his oppression was whiteness, the white, because the state was white, the police were white, all the people in authority, people who had money were white, all the capitalists were white. And then you can see him sort of, like Mark said, to struggle. You can see him learning as he goes along, a bit like, you know, as I do, you know, like as I did as I went along, you know, like it's kind of get sort of reverse racism. You should get like a kind of, like white working class people now say, you know, they've got having a hard time and stuff. And they'll say, yeah, it's all the blacks and the immigrants coming in, blacks, what's to blame? And but Bob Dylan sort of put it right, didn't he? Say, only a pawn in the game, that song. When he say, you know, you're better than him, you got white skin, you know, even though they live like shit and stuff, and they feel a bit better about it. So I think Malcolm X was a bit like that. and he had the Nation of Islam, which was Muslim. And then I think they were like really conservative in that. I won't go too long anyway, so I could see him going along, and he was developing his analysis of what was going on and what was causing the oppression. And gradually he left the Nation of Islam. I think he said that was too narrow. And anyway, then he widened out his analysis and his education, and began to see how capitalism was at the root of the oppression. And you know, you had to like join up with whites. But basically, what he first wanted was black unity first. He said, before we can have black and white unity, we have to first have black unity. So he was like, I think he was feeling his way to this, and he's feeling his way towards, like, you know, Marx's analysis of the revolution, etc., and seeing capitalism. He said one day, he said, a capitalist is a racist. So if you want to see a racist, see a capitalist. So that's kind of, so just before that, you know, he was assassinated. So I think he was cut down his prime, and he was like an education of life. And I think that's how we all get through, you know, and the struggle and that, and you know, the life struggle, like Marx says, through struggle you learn. And so I think it's interesting, and you know, I also checked out Frantz Fanon and stuff, and it's good to see some of these. It's good to see sometimes a philosophical basis to it. But anyway, I won't go on too long. But yeah, I think he was a work in progress, Malcolm X, and he just got wiped out, unfortunately, by the fascists and all that. Okay.
Cheers, Mike. Sean.
Okay, hi. I was just trying to think of responding a little bit to what Andy from Leicester said, and also what Mamuna had to say. With Andy from Leicester, I don't think Andy meant it like this, and maybe I don't need to say this, but when Andy was talking about, you know, the real division is class, not race, I think it's true that we believe that the interests of working class people, you know, united by their class, outweighs divisions between them over race. But nevertheless, those divisions, the ruling class, fight very hard to keep those divisions in place, you know. A constant barrage of racism, aren't we? Especially at the moment. Everything. I don't think, as I was going to say, Andy meant this, but some do say the way, you know, on the left, the way to fight racism is to ignore it and just organise on a class basis. You know, and I think that's a very dangerous position to take, because, as you know, people fighting for socialist position on a class basis, we have to demonstrate that we actually stand as the, you know, supporters of all the oppressed, and that we really mean it when we say we want to get rid of those divisions amongst ourselves. And we can't do that by not acknowledging that those divisions do exist, though, and have to be fought on their own, let alone as regards the, you know, the class fight. We have to explicitly always fight racism. So I don't think Andy would mean that we didn't want to, but I just want, you know, there are some people that take those kind of views, and it's important we argue against them. Mamuna's point about assassinations, I was thinking about that as an interesting point, you know, and what does it mean? Only thing that made me think about it was, you know, and you might think this is odd bringing this out, but bear with me a minute, was Lenin, revolutionary leader, you know, and most important to us because he led the only example of an actual working class revolution. We know what happened afterwards, we can't go in, but workers actually did seize power for the first time in history in Russia in 1917. And really the only time as an organised working class did they take the power completely into their own hands, you know. But before that, in July in 1917, for example, there was a huge move in Petrograd and Moscow to actually think about taking power then. And the Bolsheviks knew that the working class in Moscow and St. Petersburg were too far ahead of the rest of the working class and the peasantry throughout Russia, and they needed time to catch up that space, you know. So they put themselves at the head of the movement, but they also kind of like controlled it in such a way that it didn't end up in the confrontation that they believed they would have lost at that time. very difficult thing to organise, you know. And afterwards, as a result, to some extent, Lenin, the Bolsheviks were at a lower ebb for a while. Lenin had to actually go into hiding, you know. But then, of course, later on, you had the attempted coup by the Tsarist officer, Kornilov, and the Bolsheviks supporting the provisional democratic sort of left reformist government against him, and they rose again into an enormous powerful position as the leadership of the working class. But the point here is that the violence of the state, you know, how we respond to that requires organisation rooted in class-wide organisation, and it needs a party, you know, like Lenin created in the Bolsheviks. The influence and the knowledge and education and the way that you struggle to actually organise the fight at the right time in order to win in the end. You know, being an organisation like the SWP, which takes its lessons from those tactics of the Bolshevik Party, you know. And I'd say, when we're talking about assassinations, that's just one example of the way we're ruthless whenever we get them. And the only answer to that is a really well-rooted organisation, socialist organisation, with a strategy to fight to win in the future of revolutionary socialists. Okay, thanks.
Cheers, Sean. Thanks. We've got Andy P next.
Oh, okay, thanks. I'll just be quick if I can. I want to thank Malcolm X, really, posthumously, because the autobiography of Malcolm X was the first political book I read when I was about 16 or 17. I didn't know anything about politics really at that time, but I was intrigued by the name. I'd heard of him, and that book got me involved in politics, really, because I thought, what an incredible guy, what an incredibly intelligent guy, what an awful life that he had as a child and as a young man, and how he turned himself around, but also how he was accepting of his own death. That I think the last paragraphs of the book say that I know by the time this book is published I will be dead, and he was right, because he was assassinated between giving the sort of transcript to Alex Haley to turn into a book and the actual publication. Over those few months he was assassinated by a rival in the Nation of Islam. Incredible book. Just on the question of Pan-Africanism, I think in the 60s it was probably easier to point to national liberation movements in Africa as a model of hope, but as has been rightly pointed out, that those dreams have all turned very sour, haven't they? Mainly because of Western intervention. I just think of the murder of Patrice Lumumba from what is today the DRC as one example. But you know, the CIA was active in undermining the left in the nationalist movements in Africa, and that was often to the detriment of the movement, and caused, dictators and murderers and butchers were put into power. That's really what happened to Pan-Africanism in a lot of ways. The powers of Western capitalism were more powerful. I just want to get onto the question, I think it's seen a little bit in the chat, about whiteness and so on and so forth. It's a big discussion, and I think it's good for us to open up the discussion in here as well. But somebody on the radio a couple of weeks ago, and I wish I could have taken note of who it was who said it. It was a woman who said it. She said, "I'm fighting against oppression. If you come to me to help me, don't bother. You're wasting your time. You're wasting my time. If you come to me with the understanding that your liberation is, inextricably linked, is totally linked to my liberation, and let's join hands and fight together." Because that is the truth of the matter, isn't it? That this is a system that oppresses us all. It oppresses some of us far more, but the breaking of that system is the only route out of this appalling racist situation that we're in at the moment. And I'll leave it there.
Cheers, Andy. Clive, next.
Yes, I was going to say something similar about the autobiography of Malcolm X. When I first read it, it was one of the most formative books of my youth as well, obviously co-authored with Alex Haley. because it was so intelligent, and it did show the development of consciousness right from Malcolm's early upbringing, as Elizabeth has so well praised. So I'm not going to go through his history again, except to say that the development of Malcolm X's consciousness can be paralleled, I think, in some of the ways you see the anger against racism today amongst young black people, especially young black men, and the debate that Malcolm had internally is one that is still going on now. In the second Black Lives Matters demonstration at the Godiva statue in Coventry, there were young black men getting away, and not just because they were young, but their argument was, why are you not supporting your own local black businesses? Why are you going to Starbucks and Costa and all of these people when you've got a black cafe down the road, when you've got somebody selling, chicken and peas, and you're going to Italian restaurants? Support your own community, get your own house in order. And effectively, they were doing what Malcolm X was doing in his initial development, which is to say, we are strong, we are powerful, we are black, and we can manage without you white people, and we're going to prove it. We had economic society before you came along and took it away from us, and we can do it again. Now, Malcolm X internally developed into somebody who was quite close to being a revolutionary socialist by the time he was assassinated, realizing that black separatism wasn't the answer to the question of racism. But the polar opposite of that is a debate that we had in Coventry Trades Council, where we were arguing about Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and somebody said, well, why is we have to get involved with it? We're not, why are they not turning to us? We've been around for years in terms of struggle. And I quite clearly said, well, white men in trade unions are seen as part of the problem, not necessarily part of the solution yet. And there's a lot of convincing that needs to be done before young black people are going to come to the trade union movement, because frankly they've not seen much advancement since we've been there. They've got to hear the arguments about the Bristol bus strike and the Grunwicks and all the rest of it, where racism was central to industrial disputes. You've got to look at what's going on in America and Portland, where trade unionists are supporting Black Lives Matter, because that's not being seen. But other trade unionists were arguing, well, racism will only be overcome if we can turn these people's heads to what the real problems are. And those real problems are in their housing and social care and education. And if we can solve all those other problems, then racism will dissolve with it. Now, for good, experienced trade unionists, that's the polar opposite. We have to find a way that is in between those two positions. One which says, let's solve all of society's ills and racism will dissolve with it. As well as all other forms of oppression, gay oppression, women's oppression, all other oppressions will go with us getting rid of society, which is a bit of a utopian, make a huge step from A to Z in one go, or just stepping to B, which is these people are very angry. They want to set up their own communities and think they don't need white people, that class isn't central to the issue when it really is. We have to be very sensitive to that. My argument is we have to start where people are. And therefore, we're on the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, but we should not shirk away from the argument that says, no, don't go arguing that you need to be in your own communities and that white people cannot help. But we are all in this together. And, it's only class action which is going to defeat both racism and all of the other issues. But we have to meet them on their own ground first. Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Clive. Dave Kersey.
Okay. Good points by Clive. I just want to say something about Malcolm X, though, which is that he's presented to white people as being a divisive figure, but the reality is he was only divisive because he explained the truth about racism. So the division was between people who wanted to be serious about understanding the cause of racism and fighting it, and those who saw racism as a problem for themselves because they felt guilty about it or whatever it was. And the thing about Malcolm X was that he was never a liberal, and he won people over by clarity of his arguments, not by pandering to people's guilt or whatever their issues were. And what he did, I think, probably better than anyone else I can think of immediately in America, except perhaps James Baldwin, was explain with extraordinary clarity that the rotten core of the American state, and you can't do that with explaining, with having a very clear view about racism and the fact that America is organically racist, as the whole history of that society, as our own society here in the UK, is based on racism, which is, I guess, an additional point linking to what Clive has just said about the need to take it up within trade unions. Therefore, for me and for many white anti-racists, Malcolm X was first seen as being the enemy of our enemy, and by not seeking to be, just a friend to everybody he came across, he actually had a much more honest assessment, and one that he was able to, and he won by having clarity, arguments with people, discussions, and his ideas progressed in that way, not by trying to pander to the establishment. It's really important that we remember that, I think. And he spoke about the reality of power to people, not just, and in the end, that wasn't just about racism, because what he did was draw the links between the racist core of the American state and its weakness. And in particular, he was brilliant, I thought, about on the issue of Vietnam, because what he said was that for all its military power, for all its apparent might, the American state could not win in Vietnam because it had no heart, had no moral heart. And I've got the speech on a recording somewhere, and it's a fantastic speech he made, because what he said was that, people with just, as he described it, a bowl of rice and a rifle took on all the napalm and all the bombs and all the rest of it and won. And what he was really saying, of course, to black working people in America was, if people in Southeast Asia can take on the full might of the military state in the US, we can take it on too. So it's true that, Malcolm X's ideas developed over time, but I think the equally important lesson about Malcolm X's legacy is that if you are clear, if you don't pander to the establishment, but explain the reality, and don't try and pander to people, but explain to them what the real, the reality is behind the core and the chimera that is thrown up by the ruling class, then you can give people the energy to fight back. And when black people fight back, then white people will fight back too, and that would be along class lines. And that was the, the logic of what he was saying. He just didn't. He decided he wasn't going to do that by pandering to what he thought people wanted to hear.
Thanks, Dave. I haven't got anyone who has got their hand up. Patricia, is yours up from before, or? Sorry,
no, it's not intentionally up, forgive me.
Okay. There's been an interesting question from Heather, if you don't mind me saying, Heather, and I wondered whether you'd want to speak on that. Heather, in the chat, you put a good question about whiteness and whether you wanted to speak about that.
Hello?
Hello?
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I didn't think my microphone was working. I've got weird headphones on.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to just bring it up in the chat. Someone else spoke about just brought the term up, whiteness. And I just think it's such an interesting concept because it's so triggering to people that don't agree with Black Lives Matter. I've had lots of, I've seen lots of weird comments and things on Facebook. I tried to steer away from Facebook, but I sort of find myself looking at comments on there, and I see a lot of people, they sort of take things at face value, just sort of the term whiteness is quite literally just about your skin colour. But I think us as a movement kind of think of it as sort of how white supremacy is sort of entrenched in our whole society. And I think it's, you know, whiteness, the way that we think of whiteness is it's obviously a detrimental sort of burden on our society. And I just think a lot of people that don't agree with Black Lives Matter, or that they just don't understand what our movement is about, that they just get very triggered by sort of calling out our like race. I don't know what anyone else's views are on that, but I just sort of find that people do get very sort of angered by that term and just that they don't really understand what we mean by it, I suppose. Yeah, that's all I wanted to sort of say.
Great, thanks so much, Heather. That was great. I guess we've got a few minutes if anyone wants to answer that or comment on that, which I think is a really interesting question, comment. Andy P, were you swatting a fly or...
Yeah, sorry, I can't raise my hand.
Oh no, cool, that's all right.
Yeah, I just quickly, I mean, in America, I believe something like, in opinion polls, something like 30%, just over 30% of people in America support the idea of Black Lives Matter, the goals of Black Lives Matter, in a country where 22% roughly are African American. But so 31% say they support the broad aims of Black Lives Matter. Another 30% on top of that say that they are somewhat sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think that we can be a little bit distracted by the negativity that comes across on Facebook, because it's so easy for anonymous, I call them haters. People probably get other words for them, keyboard warriors, etc. But the haters, as somebody pointed out, every Coventry Telegraph article about Black Lives Matter triggers a great flood of these people. But we never see them. We never see them on a protest. They don't turn up at anything that we organise. And what we do get at anything that we organise is hundreds of beautiful people who want to fight back against racism. And I think that's what we've got to remember. Yes, we haven't said we've got the majority active with us, but I'll come back to that old Angela Davis quote. You know, we're starting the discussion, the argument, you know, that it's not enough just to be non-racist, as so many people are in UK society, or like to think of themselves as non-racist, at least are aware of racism and don't like to support it. Let's put it that way. I think it's possible for many people to be racist because of a lot of people, and particularly a lot of young people, are starting to recognise that and are seeing themselves as active anti-racist, and that is brilliant. I put in the chat, it's less than 2 months since George Floyd was murdered. He was murdered on the 25th of May. So it's just short of 2 months ago. And I think in that time we've moved mountains. This movement is incredible. 55 nights, 56 nights now in Seattle, Oregon. People have been protesting, and they're now sending in the federal troops in plain clothes to snatch people off the streets. It's obviously a Trumpian move to try and create the race war that he wants, but 55 nights on the trot, you know, it's incredible, the resistance in America. And the media have got bored with it and they don't report it very much, but that movement still exists and it's still very powerful.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Anyone who hasn't spoken, I'd really like to encourage to just ask a question or speak. We've got a little bit of time, so please feel you don't have to make a long contribution. Questions are great. Anybody? Okay, if no one who hasn't spoken doesn't want to speak, I'm going to ask Elizabeth to come back.
Yeah, okay. Everyone can hear me? Perfect. Thank you everyone for that discussion. I thought it was really, really good. I'm going to try and see if I can answer all your questions, so apologies if I miss anything out. On the first two contributions from Mark and Andy kind of about Black separatism. It is an attractive idea. I think you have to understand that Black people face oppression from the minute we are born, and it's very, very painful. And it's breaking away that idea that that is coming from individuals because of their white skin and not because of from a system that puts that in place. That is a learning curve, because you only really experience it for a long time from just an individual basis. It's only when you get older, it's only when you read more, it's only when you listen to other people's experiences that you see actually this is a systematic thing. So it is really attractive because there is a lot of anger and there is a lot of pain within the Black community. And I think what you're seeing is people really don't feel like being silenced anymore. And that's fantastic. I think we should capitalize on that anger. It is brilliant that so many people are willing to say enough is enough. But what it is, it's kind of sharing this idea that capitalism, Black capitalism, isn't the answer, because it's capitalism in the first place that created this racial divide. Now, that's a harder concept for people when we Black people have been cut out of so many businesses and housing opportunities because of their color of the skin. So it's almost felt like, well, if we just had the money, then we would erase that. But then when you think about it, it's the same idea about higher faces of Black places. That doesn't absolve you from racism. Oprah, billionaire, she's been told countless times in other stores that she needs to get out because they don't think she can afford it. If you think about actually when the Black Lives Matter movement started, it started in 2016 under Obama's presidency. So it's understanding the fact that it's not through Black capitalism where we get our liberation, because capitalism is a system that will just create divides. And it's also a system that will also inherently stop Black people getting to the point where they think they should get in order to benefit from capitalism. But that's a learning curve, and that's an argument that I think we should be inputting because it does attract a lot of people. However, I will say it feels like over the past couple of weeks, there is a real anti-capitalist movement along the Black Lives Matter groups. You see that Black Lives Matter UK, and I know there's so many of them, they came out with a very fantastic statement saying that not only are we anti-racist and pro-Palestine, but we're also anti-capitalist. So you're seeing that sort of political awakening with people kind of rejecting capitalist views, and I think that's really interesting. But I think it comes through learning. And I remember, like, 7 weeks ago, I don't think I've done as much reading as I have in all my years of schooling than I have in this past year. And actually understanding the origins of racism and the fact that you can track it down to like this monetary transaction through slave trade is really fascinating. That's not taught, that's not promoted, that's kind of hidden. It's kind of just, oh, this is the way society is run. White people are inherently evil, and this is just how it is. And actually, it's through understanding that not only is that not true, but there is a system that puts that in place. And I think that's, I'll go back to it in more detail when we talk about ideas of white supremacy. It's not just individuals saying, oh, white is better. It's the system that puts in place that upholds these standards, that it is, that white people have more to offer than Black people. And that type of system, through education, through the judicial system, through our schools and unions, that we kind of need to really chip away at that, because it supports the ideas of that. Mamimi, your question about assassination of leaders, I think it's very interesting. Sometimes we think the state is very passive, and the state is not passive at all. Your interesting thing about Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and also actually the Black Panthers is how heavily influenced the state. Most importantly, the FBI was involved in all their matters. In fact, actually, on his death, Malcolm X, his bodyguard, was an informant, FBI informant agent. So that shows you the high level of interference that they were putting on him, because they recognize their influence on these people. And it's very interesting that when they start to mobilize beyond their groups, that's when there is the state intervention, because I think the state recognizes the power of going beyond your racial groups and being able to mobilize mass movements, because they too understand that's the way you get change. And so you'll see they start to chip in. And so with the Black Panthers, they did all this divisions, and oh, this one's a spy and this one's this, to cause divisions. And their influence, I mean, it's kind of conspiracy, but their influence within many assassinations should put people on alarm bells. But it's most important that you learn that the state is not passive. And so this is why we have to continue in what we're doing. And so when Boris Johnson throws out statements like, oh, Black Lives Matter, we shouldn't really be like so quick to applaud people in that. We really need to keep our eye on focus. The state is very willing to support Black Lives Matter and these sort of proposals until it actually thinks those proposals are going to make change. It's very easy for Starbucks to say Black Lives Matter until it actually starts to hurt its profits. And I think with bearing that in mind, that's when we have to be even stronger and even bolder, because they'll just throw out little pieces to kind of appease people. And we have to say, no, that's not what we're really asking for. We're asking for real change, and we're going to get it. But you can't just subside us with these like petty things. And I think that's most important. The arguments about the trade unions, I honestly believe, so I'm young. I've been on these marches for about 7 weeks. The majority of people are not associated with any political party, not even Labour. So we have a broad spectrum of people who are looking for new ways of showing their political activism, and the trade unions are not that. I don't think many people in my generation understand the influence of trade unions and what they actually do. I think that's a combination of our youth. It's a combination of how many of these people have actually started working. We're talking about university students and 18-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 16-year-olds. But I have been impressed by certain trade unions. I was impressed by the NEU and how they've approached the decolonization of education. They've had many meetings on it. I've been impressed by the FBU, the firefighters, and their approach about that. And I think it's our job within the trade unions that we are in to make sure these topics are on the agendas, because quite frankly, the trade unions have been a little bit disappointing over the past couple of years. I think that's okay to say. I think it's okay to say the trade unions are not stepping up and being what the working class needs them to be. And I think that's our job within those movements to kind of say, no, you really need to put this on agenda, because that's what you're there for. You're not just there for membership fees, you're there to actually protect the working class. And this is an issue that is about the working class. So I think it brings in an interesting argument about the trade unions, but I think that's an area that we definitely need to work in to make sure that they are supported, because you're seeing it especially in America. So they've had the workers' strike yesterday, and there was the dockers a couple of weeks ago that Angela Davis actually joined in for their protest. And even in the beginning of the protests, it was, I believe, the Minneapolis bus drivers who together said, listen, we're not transporting your protesters and the people that you're arresting, that really put a dent in that work. And that's fantastic. But it's trade unions that really should be pushing this idea. It's that collective action of workers that really put a stint in the state's plan, and it really kind of pushes things away. General conversation about capitalism, bringing it back into the life kind of conversations about whiteness and our role within these movements. It's quite complicated, because a lot of complicated questions are being thrown about whiteness and white privilege and education and policing. I think those are really good. I don't think we should be alarmed when these questions come out, because I think it's a sign of a really healthy movement. I think it's a sign of people being proactive about their anti-racism, which is fantastic. I think for those of us who've been at it those of us who've been fighting longer, especially those who don't share my skin color, there is a sense of element that we need to make sure that it is the young and the people of color and those people that are oppressed that are leading these movements, because we have felt like we've been silenced so much. But that also in our approach, there needs to be a sense of humbling ourselves, because it's not that we intervene into these protests because we know what's better. It's that we intervene because we have a particular sense of politics, and we have an understanding and experience in way of organizing that usually results in change. And that's why we intervene into these moments. But that's going to take us humbling ourselves. It's also going to take us earning our stripes through our actions. You're only as good as your last intervention. And so I think when you approach it in that way, you see much more people palatable to our ideas and really wanting to listen. I think there's a portion of people that we're not going to win over. And I think that's what's brilliant about Malcolm X. He wasn't concerned about appeasing the KKK. So when you see people say, oh, all Black Lives Matter is an actually racist statement, ignore those people. Those people aren't on our agenda. Those are usually fascist people. Those are usually people that you saw in like London who just want to drink and smoke and create huff for whatever reason. Those are not the people that we really, really need to be focusing on, because they're just going to be racist, and we don't have to appease racists. We really, really don't. We need to be focusing on the other people, the actual people who actually really want to learn, who actually are saying, how can I help? Dave, was it Andy? You brought in, someone brought in, no, it was Mark. You brought in the interesting idea about Malcolm X and the co-ed girl. And it's true. So Malcolm X was at university and there was a co-ed blonde white lady and she asked, how can I help? And he was very cold to her and he said nothing. And in his autobiography, he writes how he actually really regretted that. He actually really regretted not being able to encourage her and show that. And I think we need to be strong in saying, listen, there is definitely a place for white people. Definitely a place for white people, because there's a place for all people, because it's through this mass action of the working class uniting, not because class is greater than race, because it's not sort of an oppression Olympics, but it's actually because class is something that links us all together, and because actually all white people don't benefit from racism the same. And that's actually a concept that's quite difficult to understand, especially if you're facing the oppression. But it's true, not all white people face oppression in the same way that not all Black people are monolithic, so we don't actually all have the same goals for Black liberation, which is fine. It's people are different, but I think it's through arguing it and fighting for that argument, and it will get difficult at times, and maybe sometimes we're individually not always the best people to do that, but I think it's putting in that actually it's when we unite together, because that's when we're the strongest. That's when there's more of us on this basis of that you, the top, benefit from this and we do not benefit from this, and actually ending all oppression is a better world for all of us that we can win in the struggle. So I'll leave it at there, but it's very important that we kind of stick to our politics, we fight for our politics, we learn. It's always good to learn, it's always good to improve our arguments. They're going to be sometimes hard and difficult to debate, but that we keep to it, because it is a really important fight to fight.
Thanks.